What's up everyone, it's Q from RetroQ Gaming, and I just want to put in a quick foreword right at the start of this video, just because it's something that's important to me. Now, it's currently the morning of the 17th of November 2017, and the video you're about to see, I'm actually maybe about halfway through shooting the entire thing, and Cinemassacre have released their own version of this video. Now, you probably know Cinemassacre. They're a very, very popular YouTube channel. You'd know them from AVGN specifically, most likely, but it's just important for you guys to know, at least it's important for me, that you guys know that I am not stealing their content. I'm not stealing their idea or anything like that. I'm sure you've seen on the channel that I haven't had any content like that. It's just an unfortunate timing. I can't wait to watch the Cinemassacre version as soon as I get my own one fully shot, edited and uploaded, because I don't want to be influenced by it in any way, shape or form. But it's just important to me, at least anyway, for you guys to know that I would never steal anyone's content. You know I'm against that stuff. So that's it. Thank you for watching, guys, and I hope you enjoy this upcoming video. What's up everyone, it's Q from RetroQ Gaming, and I decided I'd do something a little bit different here. So what we're going to do is, without all the generations of console from all the different manufacturers, whatever, we've got so many different controllers, way to control stuff, and it's essentially what's bound us to these consoles over time. Between D-pads, analog sticks, multiple face buttons, buttons being labelled in different places, buttons being laid out in different formats. So many different things have changed, so many different things have stayed the same. So we're going to look at all the major controllers of all the major consoles from, we'll say the first, well, I can't say first console generation, but let's start all the way back with the NES and the Sega Master System generation and work our way forward. All the primary controllers and a lot of the refreshes. Now, I will say one thing, the only one that will be missing from this video that I'm aware of will be the Sega Master System, as I actually don't have a Sega Master System yet. I do plan on getting one eventually, but the circumstances have never lined up perfectly as I would have hoped. So without further ado, let's get started on what I can only call the Classic. No, not the Nintendo Classic, but the actual Nintendo controller itself. The NES controller, the Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES, whatever you want to call it. It's a very simple controller, very good D-pad, one of the best D-pads there actually is. Start and select and 2 face buttons. It's essentially, arguably, all they needed. Now, the only beef that many people have with this controller, despite it being completely iconic, is it's not very ergonomic. Hard plastic corners everywhere. Nothing but sharp edges and angles. Great controller to use. Like I said, excellent D-pad. Very good quality buttons. This was back when stuff was actually quality made. But the problem is holding it for a long amount of time, and even during those intense game sessions where your hands tighten up a bit, it kind of digs in. Now, by comparison, when the NES Classic did come out, Nintendo made a perfect size replica of the actual NES controller. It's the same size, the same shape. The only difference is that it uses a different connector on the back. This one uses the Wii style connector. This obviously uses the original NES one. And the controller, or the cables on this one, are considerably shorter. And before we forget, we'll keep it going with something nice and, we call it retro, I suppose it is at this point. We have the Famicom. Now, the Famicom is the Japanese version of the NES, but the controllers are minorly different in several ways. One, they're actually hardware attached to the console. 2, they still feature the same layout, but they do certainly feel smaller. Now, I don't know if the dimensions are officially smaller, but they do feel slightly smaller. Obviously, they look a bit different. Still has the same quality D-pad. Start and select, A and B, all very robust quality presses. But one thing that is very interesting, which I'm sure everyone knows at this point, is that controller number 2 has no start and select button, but it's got a volume level and it's got a microphone. The microphone famously being used to kill Pole's voice in Legend of Zelda, something that was still referenced in the US and PAL manuals, but couldn't actually be done in those versions because neither of the controllers had a microphone input. Now, next up, we're moving on to our best console generation ever. If you don't agree, come fight me. But the point I'm trying to make here is we're moving on to, yes, you guessed it correctly, the Super Nintendo. An upgrade over the original Nintendo in multiple different ways. Not only is it a more ergonomic controller because it's got the rounded edges instead of hard corners everywhere, even on the flat surface or the flat edge here, it's still slightly rounded. It's nowhere near as much as of a hard edge, a hard corner. But anyway, let's take an actual look at the controller. We've got still one of an excellent quality D-pad, as you expect from Nintendo back in the day. Start and select. And 4 face buttons. Now obviously I'm European, so this is a European controller, so we do have the 4 different color layout, similar to the Super Famicom, as opposed to the American version. And again, 2 shoulder buttons up at the top. Excellent controller, one of the best suited and one of the best ever made. And just as a quick comparison, there is your US counterpart. So for the US one, it's got the 2-tone ugly purple, as I like to call it, similar to that you'd find on the actual console itself. One thing to note as well is the A and B buttons on these are kind of domed, and the Y and X buttons are concave versus convex. Whereas on our European one, all the buttons are domed, they're all convex. Now, sticking in the same generation to go with their head-to-head counterpart, we have our Batarang, aka our Sega Mega Drive controller, Sega Genesis for you Americans out there. Now, what's notable about this one is it's got considerably less buttons. It's got a start button, and it's got 3 main buttons, A, B, C, 3 face buttons. There were variants released, official variants released later on in the console's lifespan that actually added 3 more buttons, so you'd have A, B, C, X, Y, Z to kind of compete and be a comparable controller to the Super Nintendo, as this one has no shoulder buttons and only 3 of the 4 face buttons. No select button as well, but it's got a divisive D-pad, for the simple reason is when you look at the D-pad on a Sega Mega Drive controller, it's more floaty on the pivot, if that makes sense. It's got an easier push for all of the diagonals as well. Now, depending on what you're used to, that can roll quicker and smoother, or if it gets really loose after excessive use, it actually becomes very, very hard to use, I found. But overall, still a very decent controller. And just to finish up the 16-bit generation, we have a Super Nintendo mouse. Despite this being an EU PAL mouse, it still does have the 2 purple buttons, unlike the actual EU controllers, which have the colourful layout and palette of buttons. This one, not primarily just used for Mario Paint like many people remember. It is used by a few other games. Wolfenstein 3D actually uses this, believe it or not, as well as a few others. Now, moving on from the 16-bit era to the 32-bit era, we have a version of the PlayStation 1 controller. Unfortunately, this is actually the 3rd refresh of the PlayStation 1 controller. Most people think the Dualshock, which is this one here, is actually only the 2nd controller for the PS1. It's actually the 3rd. There is the original controller, which was exactly the same, except it had no analog sticks and no vibration motor. And the first refresh, the 2nd version of the controller, was very similar to what you see here. These pieces, the actual hand grips, were longer. It did have the analog sticks. They were slightly different. They didn't have the rubber tips. They were more concave, like, say, the Xbox One controllers are now, or the Xbox One sticks. And it had 2 different analog modes, standard and flight mode. Now, I don't have one of those either anymore, unfortunately, but the one we're going to look at here is the Dualshock, which would, of course, become the standard for Sony going forward. They have a Dualshock 2, a Dualshock 3, and a Dualshock 4. Big thing with this is, like many of the other controllers, they do copy the other companies, keep some of the stuff, and develop some of their own stuff as well. So we have the iconic X, circle, triangle, and square buttons. Most people call this cross. It's always an X button to me. You've got your start and select. You can swap in your analog and your DualShock modes, turn it off. Obviously, the big thing is because it's a DualShock, it's got your vibration force feedback, 2 analog sticks left and right, as with the Sony format. They're actually obviously both, what's the word I'm looking for, symmetrical. You've got a decent quality D-pad, not as good as the previous Nintendo iterations, but still a quality D-pad. And you have your L1, R1, L2, R2 shoulder buttons. overall, a good controller for the simple reason is it's become iconic. It's pretty comfortable, but over time it can grate on you in the sense that I can use it for short bursts. The same with all the Sony controllers. I'm not a fan of symmetrical sticks. Now, staying within the same generation, the 32-bit generation, we have Sega's offering the Sega Saturn. A great controller in many, many aspects. It basically looks like the standard refreshed version of the Sega Mega Drive controller in the sense that it's got your ABC, XYZ. It's got your 6 buttons. To compete with everything else, to make sure it's arguably comparable, it does have 2 shoulder buttons. So it does have technically 8 normal buttons, like say the PlayStation 1 controller has, because it will be XYZ, ABC, LR, that's 8, versus the 4 on the PlayStation 1 controller and the 4 shoulder buttons. The big difference is no analog sticks, only a start button, no select, but a very comfortable controller, and it has an absolutely godlike D-pad. One of the best D-pads there is. It's up there with the NES and the SNES. Godlike D-pad. You could almost argue it's slightly better because while an extremely high quality D-pad, it also makes it nice and easy for the directions, the corner diagonals too. Absolutely godlike. My only big issue with this controller is the shoulder buttons. The 2 shoulder buttons. They are you'll hear them, they're very clicky and they're very easy to press and very fast and quick to press. My only complaint is those shoulder buttons. Now, just to finish up the same generation, I'm actually going to show a third-party variant of the same controller because I put it on camera a second ago and my god, my original N64 controller really needs a proper and thorough dusting, so it's embarrassing to actually show on camera. But this will be close enough to the same thing because we have our good old boy, the N64 controller. Still have not discovered what race this controller is actually for because of the extremely weird shape. It does allow multiple different variants. For some games you could, in theory, play like this, some like this, or some like this. This would be the main one you'd find for a lot of people. One thing to note as well is that yes, this technically does predate the analog and Dualshock controller configurations from Sony, hence the analog stick. You do have a little Z button hit at the back, and you're probably wondering what this is here at the top. Well, there's an expansion port built straight into the controller in the back here. So you can put in extra peripherals, like say I have the Rumble Pack inserted. I'm trying to organize it through the camera versus looking in person. Or you can actually put in stuff like memory packs, or games like Pokemon Stadium would have a special add-on where you could actually plug in your Pokemon X and Y, your Pokemon Red and Blue cartridge, and you could actually play it in duo speed or Dodrio speed, which would be double or triple speed, actually on the TV, import your Pokemon, etc., etc. Generally, a good controller depending on what you needed it for. The analog sticks back in the day were really good. The problem is they wore out and got very, very loose. Now, because this is a new third-party one, the controller stick, the analog stick on this is extremely tight, almost to its detriment. I somehow managed to have my actual N64 controller, which is still relatively tight, my official one, which is very good. Everyone that I know that has N64s is very jealous of my main N64 controller, just because my first party one is still in such good, tight condition. But overall, it can be a bit weird considering that you've got one stick, you've got your D-pad or your C buttons and your D-pad on the opposite side. So in an era where other consoles, or specifically the PlayStation, had, say, games that would incorporate looking around with 2 sticks, you know, move with the left, look with the right. Thank you very much, Alien Trilogy, the first game that actually did that. And then you come back to some N64 games where you would actually have to look around with buttons. Very jarring and disheartening to come back to after going from the other. One final little honourable mention as well. We got the PlayStation mouse. Could be used in many different things. I specifically bought it for Command and Conquer games because I used to play the shit out of them. And back in that exact era, I didn't have a PC at the time to play Command and Conquer games. So I was playing them all on the PlayStation 1, sometimes even link cable. Somehow, somewhere, Brendan, if you ever see this, this is what I kicked your ass with the whole time. But yeah, this is pretty much it. Now, moving one era forward, we're going to have a lot to cover in this generation. But we're going to start off with the one that everyone is most familiar with, the gold standard, the classic PlayStation 2 controller. Very similar to the Dualshock controller in the sense that it has the same design, same layout, same quality D-pad. You've got your select and start button in the center. Again, your switch to toggle on your Dualshock, your analog features. You've got your two symmetrical analog sticks, X, circle, square, triangle. Your two sets of shoulder buttons. But the big thing on this one, the last time that Sony made a good controller, if you ask me, was the PlayStation 2. Not a fan of the DualShock 3, not a fan of the DualShock 4. But the big thing that this controller has that I haven't seen any other controller have before or after this. These four face buttons, X, square, triangle and circle, are all analog buttons. That's right, these are touch sensitive analog buttons. The most common use and the most use that everyone is familiar with for the analog face buttons is Metal Gear Solid 2 and Metal Gear Solid 3. For example, you can ready your weapon, I believe it's with square. If you want to accidentally put your weapon away, or not, if you accidentally draw it or you want to put it away so you can move to a better position or change weapon, whatever it is, you can slowly, softly release the button and it will put it down. Something that has been missing from every controller from every manufacturer since then. Analog face buttons. You did it right, Sony. Unfortunately, you got rid of it. Everyone, bring it back. Next up, we've got a controller that the majority of people out of this generation are probably least familiar with. The Sega Dreamcast. The last controller, I should say, ever made for a home console by Sega. Now, overall, a good controller, mind you, because it's nice, it's big, I like big controllers, I've got decent sized hands, so it's comfortable, that's the big thing. You've got your four face buttons, a single start button, no select. You've got we'll get to the D-pad and the analog stick now in a minute. It does have one analog stick, the only console of this generation to have one analog stick, as well as two technically shoulder buttons, but yes, also triggers. And the big draw and the big thing with this controller is your two expansion ports. One of them has a window for the front. So what we have here is our VMU. This, which I'm sure you can get multiple details on in other videos, so I won't bore you with that, is the memory card for the Sega Dreamcast. Depending on the game you're playing, stuff that would be information relevant to whatever game you're playing will appear on screen. Pretty cool feature. I usually compare it for Resident Evil Code Veronica. Instead of going into the menu to check your health the whole time, your health monitor flashes on here constantly. Extra handy little bonus. And then in the back, I personally have a vibration pack, the rumble pack, because the controller does not feature rumble by default. Only major complaints with this controller. One, its lack of comparable buttons. Okay, all the other consoles, all the other controllers have four face buttons. Doesn't have a start and select, doesn't have an extra button. So back then, it could rule some of the extra ports of other console games out because there's just not enough buttons. Same with the feature or the fact that there's a second stick missing. That's another thing you're going to miss. The two triggers were nice, but you only have two shoulder buttons. Let's flip it around. Apologies for the cable management. You only have two shoulder buttons instead of most of the other controllers which had either 3 or 4. The hard plastic analog stick. Big complaint for a lot of people. Could dig right into your fingers, especially after an extended period of time. And then, probably the biggest one. Actually, no, I just remembered one other one. Sega, why do you put the controller connection at the bottom of the damn controller? Now, there's a slight little notch here for cable management. But at the bottom, if you want to rest this on your lap, on your stomach, on your whatever, you're going to have this digging at the bottom of you. But the big, major issue I want to talk about is this. A decent, responsive D-pad made of hard plastic with an edge like a fucking razor. This thing will cut you up after just a few minutes of using it. It will kill you. And that is how it killed the Sega Dreamcast and killed Sega's hardware business forever. So next up we'll come to Nintendo's offering during this generation. Kind of, I won't say questionable, but kind of different. Very innovative to an extent. We'll get to why now in a second. But it's a controller loved by many, kind of overhyped by many if you ask me. While a good controller in itself, it's not as great and best controller ever made as everyone else makes it out to be. The Nintendo Gamecube controller. Probably the best thing about this controller is that it's actually designed for human hands. Something that Nintendo missed out with on their previous controller, the Nintendo 64. It's got a nice, soft, responsive analog stick. Soft rubber at the top, which was always very, very nice. It's got an okay D-pad, can't really complain. It's a little small if you ask me, or at least it feels a little small. You've got your C-stick moved up from your 4 C buttons from the N64. It is a little bit smaller than your left analog stick, but even compared to, say, other controllers that had 2 analog sticks, it still has an analog stick. It's still a nice stick in general, albeit a little bit small. And personally, I'm a fan of the offset sticks like these, and that you'd find on, say, an Xbox controller or something like that, rather than the symmetrical ones on a PlayStation controller. One thing that was a bit of an issue for some people is the change of face button layout. Gone are the 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and now we have this. A, B, Y, X. Kind of weird if you ask me as well. Another thing that's a little bit strange with this controller is that it doesn't actually have 4 shoulder buttons. It's only got 3. You have an L button, an R button, and a Z button. Now, having said all that, this controller's strongest point, if you ask me personally, the last time Nintendo used analog shoulder buttons, the Wii, the Wii U, and now the Nintendo Switch all have digital shoulder buttons. These are analog shoulder buttons. You press this down slightly, something barely happens. You press it down more and more pressure, more and more speed, more and more whatever is applied in-game. Nintendo took a step back and removed this in previous consoles, which is a complete detriment, especially when nowadays, for the Xbox 360, the PlayStation 3, the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 all offer analog triggers, analog shoulder buttons. Nintendo, you're being left out by your own damn fault. Interesting thing to note about the GameCube controller is that it's the preferred controller of Super Smash Bros. Players, to the point where obviously it would work naturally on the Nintendo GameCube. It would work natively on the Nintendo Wii as well because it had 4 controller ports. But because it's the preferred controller, that Nintendo actually released an official GameCube Wii U adapter to have 4 controller ports compatible for the Wii U. And due to an update in the latest version of the Nintendo Switch firmware, this, powered by 2 USB ports, actually now works on Nintendo Switch, and you can use it for select games. That basically any games that have enough buttons. Very interesting, very handy for people who love the GameCube controller. And believe it or not, Nintendo for once were kind of ahead of the game. Usually we equate Nintendo with being behind when it comes to hardware, but this wasn't fully the case in the Nintendo GameCube era. For the simple reason is Nintendo offered a wireless official first-party controller. That's right, has all the features and functions with the exception, I believe, of Rumble. I can't remember if this has a Rumble feature. With the exception of just the Rumble feature, this is an exactly performing GameCube controller. Still works very, very well, because back then wireless technology wasn't the best, but whatever Nintendo did, they actually made it work. Exactly the same controller, only slightly bigger just to factor in the wireless thing, It does use AA batteries on there as well. Is it AA or AAA? It's AA batteries. You pop them in the back, you're good to go. And then at the bottom, you've got a little wireless channel selector. Plug this little bad boy into one of the controller ports on your GameCube. Pick the appropriate channel. There's multiple different channels, so basically if you've got 4 people using Wavebirds, which is this bad boy, you'd say put player 1 on channel 1, so it doesn't interfere, doesn't control the wrong one, etc, etc. I believe it's got like 12, 14 or 16 channels, just for some magical reason. If you've got 4 people on one GameCube in one room, 4 people on the other, it doesn't all interfere and whatever, destroy each other, mess with each other's game. Pretty exciting to see that Nintendo actually innovating in some aspects with a quality first-party wireless controller. We'd seen wireless controllers from other consoles, other manufacturers and all in previous days. They were always really third-party, generally pretty shit, generally infrared instead of full-on proper wireless. And although this one isn't strictly, I suppose, a first-party controller, it is officially licensed by Nintendo. I'll just throw it in here real quick as well. This is a Hori Nintendo Gamecube Pad in the likeness of the Super Nintendo controller. So yeah, it's got your 4 face buttons, similar to the GameCube. It does have a GameCube connection. So what I loved about this is that it was very, very good for a lot of the retro style games or 2D platformers on the GameCube and could be used on the Wii, believe it or not, for virtual console games, which I absolutely loved. It does have a Z button as well, 2 shoulder buttons, and other than that, it's everything you would expect from a quality Hori product. Start and select. You've got your 4 face buttons. It works brilliantly for all that, as well as you'd expect. And finally, just to finish up the generation, we have a new challenger appearing. This challenger takes the form of Microsoft with their big bad boy controller, aka the Duke. Many people hated this controller. They think it's too big. I've praised this controller multiple times because I have decent sized hands and I like a decent sized controller. The buttons, pretty good. Pretty good. I like the feel of the buttons. They do have a certain responsiveness to them. The black and white buttons, aka kind of L1, R1, are in a bit of a weird spot. I generally didn't have too much of an issue back in the day once I got used to them. But now going back to this, for example, I used this a couple of weeks ago just to connect up my OG Xbox and play some original Splinter Cell. It was kind of a challenge to get back used to it, but I used to love them back in the day. Unfortunately, this D-pad was a bit of a mess. The sticks were great. They've got, one thing I especially liked about them is, I don't know if you can see it too well, but on the right stick, which was generally used for looking around, it looks more like a crosshair, because that would be what you're moving with this stick. Whereas this one, they've got the full-on standard, seat your thumb in it, move it around, stick. 2 triggers, as you'd expect, so it is equivalent to, say, the PlayStation 2. It has the same amount of buttons as a PlayStation 2 controller, and has 2 expansion ports for, say, memory cards and the like. And one final thing to note about this as well is Microsoft wanted to alleviate, well, because their console was so big, heavy, and easily breakable, and I think it was kind of expensive, I don't really remember. Microsoft wanted to say, gone are the days of tripping over a long wire, going across your room, a child running across, someone walking, not even noticing it, a dog, a cat, whatever, pulling the wire down, pulling the console down, boom, you're dead. So, a breakaway controller cable. Excellent feature, incorporated in by Microsoft, saved my friends and myself a few times, despite how careful we generally were, but nice little addition to see in there from Microsoft, especially considering it was their first foray into consoles. And then finally we've got the Xbox, well, I was going to say the Xbox One, the OG Xbox S controller. It's essentially the same as the Duke, but it's reduced in size with a little bit of a small layout change. These buttons here, the black and white buttons, they used to be above, if you remember. Everything shrank down, condensed in size, and these have moved place. They're now under it. So you can have your hands here and just press it just like that. Now, that doesn't really look like a great example, but you see what I mean. Also, the start and select buttons have moved from their usual spot to just under your left thumbstick. One thing I will note as well is on this one, they do both have the same style concave sticks. Everything else is the same. They still use the same style, same size expansion ports. And the D-pad on this one is slightly improved over the previous Duke controller. I'm not personally a fan of this Xbox One S controller. It was always too small for me. I think maybe, just maybe, I spent too much time with the Duke and got used to the Duke as my main controller that I couldn't deal with this. This one was primarily developed for the Japanese market, but was eventually ported outside for the US and Europe for, well, fan demand really, but it never really took off for me. So up next, we move on to the newest generation of the lot. We're not on the current one just yet, but we're going to move to the housewives' favourite. The Wii. The Wiimote, the Wii Remote, whatever you want to call it. It will forever be known as the Wiimote. Generally a hated controller by myself and many others because it ushered in the era of waggle gameplay, which everyone hated. Didn't fit real proper games. It was just a casual, like I said, housewives' favourite, and it didn't translate well to real style gameplay. I mean, hell, look at Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, for example. Over 100 million Wii's sold and less than a 4% install base because of forced motion controls in that game. Really annoying. Very few buttons, because when you look at it really, you've got a trigger. You've got maybe, depending on how the game would work with it, 4, maybe 5 buttons and a D-pad and your motion control. Very, very poor in that aspect. One thing I will give the Wiimote and Nintendo credit for is its modular design. The extra connector here at the bottom, the modular design. This was actually really handy because it allowed multiple different controller attachments, multiple different extra peripherals to go in. The most common of which being the Nunchuck, which is basically the second half of the controller for the most part. Comes with slight, not as advanced motion in the actual controller, in the Nunchuck as well. A second stick, because let's face it, sticks are definitely required. And 2 buttons on this one. So still doesn't make up a full controller, which, well, we saw by the one of the many reasons that the Wii didn't get the proper real deal ports. But on the plus side, there were many other benefits too. Certain games, because they did require real controllers, there were separate real controller attachments. I believe this is called a virtual console controller, or the gamepad. I can't remember the actual official full name for this one. But this one just plugs via the same little modular connector into the bottom, and you're good to go. And it gives you a real style controller. 4 face buttons, start and select, 2 sticks, a D-pad, and 4 shoulder buttons. Very good for old school style virtual console games, as well as more real involving games. I know I played Xenoblade Chronicles with this exact controller. There is also the original version of that, which I do have, but I can't actually find, which kind of annoys me because I could have sworn I kept it with all the other ones. It was almost a Super Nintendo shaped controller, but it had additional buttons to make up for the lack of buttons that would have been on a Super Nintendo controller versus a modern one. But just to give you an extra benefit of, or an extra idea of the benefit of the modular design and the multiple different attachments and all that can be connected into it, you have the likes of this bad boy. This is actually the Nez Classic, the Nez Mini, whatever it is in your region. This is the Nez Mini controller. Uses that little same connector, plugs right in, and I can use this with virtual console games. So it's superior to this in every way. Even though it has enough buttons to properly emulate a NES game, this is still the way to go. And as an extra benefit too, we've got one of these bad boys. Same deal as well for your Super Nintendo games, or say Sega Mega Drive games, whatever. Anything that has enough buttons to use on this bad boy, this is definitely the way to go. Now this one isn't actually my SNES Mini controller. This one is my old Club Nintendo controller. I actually got this for redeeming all my stars years ago. And I used the hell out of this controller simply because I played a shitload of virtual console on the Wii and on the Wii U. So this is actually, even though it is the same connector as the 2 controllers that are actually in the other room right now, sitting in my Super Nintendo Mini, this is still something separate. But excellent the fact that, because obviously this predated the SNES Classic by what, 10 years, maybe even more, so it comes in dead handy. But it gives you an idea to the versatility of the actual modular design of the Wiimote. One thing that would be completely remiss to mention as well when it comes to the modular design and the Wiimote itself is that eventually, because of imprecise controls and imprecise waggling, we'll call it, that Nintendo actually released an add-on that was required for some games. Connected into the bottom here, it was a small, maybe inch-by-inch block called the Wii Motionplus. So it gave it enhanced recognition of actual movement and all as well. It's hard to say if it was good or bad or successful or unsuccessful, but eventually Nintendo actually started building them into the controllers. And when you did get a Wii Motionplus inside controller, as they were called, they were physically the same size. Because if you had one of these bad boys, one of these original ones, and you got a Wii Motionplus extra block, you had an extra little block down here at the bottom. Now it was maybe only an inch long, an inch wide, whatever, but it was still an extra little add-on that could easily be lost, knocked off, broken, whatever. But by comparison, exact same size. Now this is the Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword limited edition controller. This one came with the actual collector's edition of the game. And this one, if you can see here on the bottom, actually has Wii Motionplus built inside. But other than that, it's exactly the same in every single way. It just has more precise controls, and it can be used with any game that requires Wii Motionplus. So next up we'll move on to Sony's offering of the 7th generation. Now this is a much hated controller to the point of vocal outcry and what essentially got it completely changed. We have not a Dualshock 3, but this is a PlayStation 3 Sony Sixaxis controller. This thing is absolutely terrible. It's arguably the worst controller that Sony have ever made. Between the standard PS1 controller, the analog PS1 controller, the DualShock 1, the DualShock 2, this one, the DualShock 3, and the DualShock 4, this is probably the worst controller they've ever made. This controller has no vibration function whatsoever. And not only that, because you can't be saying, oh, but there was controllers before, Sony made controllers before there was DualShock, and they weren't panned. But Sony arguably helped, I won't say revolutionize, but pioneer, because, I mean, let's face it, there was the N64 at the time as well. But at the same time, Sony helped bring it really, really far forward. And to remove it after it being in 2 of their previous generations of controllers was absolutely stupid. Now the reason why they did that is because they wanted to copy Nintendo and put in the whole 6-axis movement thing. So there was 6 axes, I believe it's called, that it could rotate on. So let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I think the other one is 5, 6. I don't remember. It's Sony. It's stupid. But apparently the whole the 6-axis would have been interrupted and interfered with by the presence of a vibration motor and all that stuff. So when we look at the top on here, let me see if I can get it without the light reflecting. That is terrible. It's okay, guys. I'm a professional. It says 6-axis. You'll see there's no DualShock 3 written on the bottom here. So the big issue is that everyone wanted their rumble back, and this is the flimsiest, lightest piece of shit controller there is. This feels like a Fisher-Price toy you would pick up for €5. Naturally, there was massive vocal outcry over it, and, well, it was changed pretty damn quickly that Sony announced a DualShock 3. And on top of that as well, the motion controls, or 6-axis, whatever it is in this, were absolute dirt. Of course, get wrecked, Sony. And that's where we come to our proper version of it. We have the PlayStation 3 controller, the proper PlayStation 3 controller, I should say. This bad boy is, now let's see if it can focus and get in on here, our 6-axis and DualShock 3. So this one still does have all the terrible 6-axis motion control that no one wants to use and was shoehorned into a bunch of games that everyone still fucking hated. But the big thing is this is basically a real controller again. Now, I will say this, it has the vibration features, it has the vibration motor, similar that you'd have in the DualShock 1, the DualShock 2, and the DualShock 4, so it still has that, it can be used like a real controller. Because of the extra weight of the DualShock motors and stuff, it actually does feel like a real controller, it feels good. However, there is one major gripe that myself and a huge majority of other players actually had with both the DualShock 3 and the 6-axis. The triggers on these here. they're somewhat half triggers. They still try to emulate the shoulder buttons of, say, the PS2. And they kind of tried to go with to emulate the almost trigger style systems we've seen in other consoles, like the OG Xbox, hell, even the Dreamcast, or previous to this, the 360. And because of that, we get this kind of weird half trigger system. Now, these were universally hated as well, because these were absolute pieces of shit. It was absolutely terrible. Between the accidental ease of pressing them when you didn't want them, or the real horrible feel, and just the fact that they weren't actual triggers and they weren't actual shoulder buttons, they were something halfway in between that everyone hated and never felt like they really worked properly. It was a real bad move, and you can see that that was rectified when we move forward. And just before we leave the Sony camp completely, we're gonna go with their, I don't even know what to call this, we call it their Nintendo Wii Ripoff. We all know that during that era the Wii was king. It had billions and gajillions and zillions of sales, and it was a housewife favourite, which would explain the design of what I'm about to show you, hint hint. But the point I'm trying to make, at least anyway, is Sony wanted to emulate that. They wanted to try capture the audience. They wanted to say, hey, you're familiar with the Wii and the controls of the Wii. Well, guess what? This big black PlayStation that you have is better than your baby Wii, but it's the same thing. It's more powerful and bigger and better and blacker. So you get the idea why it's the housewife's favorite. But Sony tried to emulate that with this piece of shit here. You can see why I was talking about the design of this one, you know. But the point I'm trying to make is this is the PlayStation Move, and I don't even officially know what this controller is called. I think it's like the PlayStation Move Plus or some shit, I don't remember. But this one was their answer to the Wiimote. It flopped horribly because there was multiple different problems with it. This piece of shit you have here, not only is it absolutely terrible, and Sony can't do motion controls to save their life, they still can't on the PS4 mind you, let alone back in the PS3 days, but this one, this little ball here, if that's what we want to call it, actually glows different colours, and it required the Sony Move camera to actually track this. So it tracked it, it didn't just track it based on its actual motions and movement, it tracked it based on the location of this ball, which was really annoying. And because Sony still were absolutely terrible at motion controls and just how it would track it, if you have one of these, and you have ever played Heavy Rain with a Dualshock 3, you already know that the motion controls in that game can be pretty dodgy as it is. Now, because of the general low quality of Sony's PlayStation motion controls in general, you have this piece of dirt. This is even worse. So first off, let me give you a comparison. Probably the most responsive way to play Heavy Rain is on a PlayStation 3. Now, I don't mean that in frame rate and control or whatever, I mean in regards to the motion controls. It's the PlayStation 3, because even on the PS4, the motion controls are absolutely dire. I've actually flopped and failed more times on the PlayStation 4 version of Heavy Rain than I have on the PlayStation 3 version, despite having played the PS3 version so much more. Just because the motion controls and how Sony handled them are absolutely terrible. This is even worse than the PlayStation 4. I bought this because I wanted to try out the Heavy Rain version, the Heavy Rain Move Edition, because I love Heavy Rain. It was my game of the year for 2012, or 2010, I'm sorry. Well, Jesus, wow, I got that one so mixed up. But the point I'm trying to make here, at least, I said that way too much, is that this is an absolute abomination. It's the same with this. This is like the wireless, think of it as the wireless nunchuck. It's basically the same. The only thing I will say is that this has benefited me one time. No, not like that, you dirty pervs. I'm not a housewife. But I was going to say the point I'm trying to make, I caught myself there. The way that this one did benefit me is one time, a friend of mine, I don't know if you're ever going to see this, Dempsey, somehow if you do, this one's for you. He came down and we played. He actually had this as well. We didn't realize each other had one. And he mentioned how he had just brought down, I'm going to drop it and break it, his House of the Dead Overkill. So the actual only proper use for this is basically as a light gun, kind of like a pointer. And it's the only proper use. And we sat there, or did we stand there? I don't remember. And we played the entire game of House of the Dead Overkill. I realized it was a Wii game ported over to PS3, but we had access to the PS3 version. And that was the only time this has come in useful. Now, if I ever get PlayStation VR, hint hint, I never will. Apparently these can be used with it. is all I say. But yeah, you get the point. Absolute fail. Now we move on to the household name that everyone knows, every real gamer knows, and every real gamer loves. The Xbox 360 controller. One of the most praised controllers for the longest time. Now this is my original, almost launched 360 controller, because I didn't get my 360 at launch. I got it maybe 2 or 3 months after. It came out in November of 2005. I got mine in about January or February of 2006. So this is still that controller, believe it or not. Now this controller has seen absolute battle in every way, shape or form, but it is a fantastic controller for the most part. It's very ergonomically designed. It's got triggers, which we all love and expect these days. It's got shoulder buttons, like actual digital clicky shoulder buttons too. It's got your standard 4 face buttons. One thing I actually really like about the Xbox 360 controller is that the face buttons are actually pretty responsive. Not on this one, mind you, because I've abused this into the ground. This is what's colloquially known between me and my friends as my Phantasy Star controller. I played Phantasy Star Online for God knows how long, an MMO, mind you. And my primary attack button was X. So I don't know if you can hear this, but let's give it a go. So you can hear, hopefully, the overall clickiness of the A, B, and Y buttons. Now let's listen to my X button. I don't know if you could hear that, but it's squishy. There's basically no feedback and no response whatsoever. Like I said, overall it's a great controller. It still uses the 2 off-center sticks, which is a better design than the 2 symmetrical sticks anywhere. The biggest problem with this controller, there's 2 main problems that a lot of people have with this controller. One is the battery pack. It doesn't have an internal battery, but you can obviously get your Play and Charge Kit batteries, which do give it good lifespan, or you can use AA batteries. But the fact that it was additional cost and it wasn't actually built into the controller, there's advantages and disadvantages. For example, if the battery in the controller dies or has a fault, you can just pop it out and replace it. Put in some normal batteries, put in a different battery pack, or if one battery pack dies, you can just pop in another one and boom, you're good to go a couple of seconds later. Instead of sending off the controller or getting it repaired or replaced or whatever, if the battery dies in it and something goes wrong, like in a PS3 or a PS4 controller. Now, the other big issue with this one is the D-pad. The D-pad on this is absolute shite. The D-pad is basically almost borderline unusable on this. Now, I don't know if you can see it on this, but let's look at the sticks. You can see it ever so slightly. Because this controller has been absolutely beaten to death, the sticks on this don't even stay in place. Kind of a common occurrence with Xbox 360 controllers after heavy use, but it is what it is. I've gotten so much use out of this controller, I'm surprised it even lasted me as long as it did. And just for a quick comparison, when I did technically upgrade, it came with it. This is my current one. It's basically the same in every way. I can't even say it's got a slightly upgraded D-pad, it just feels exactly the same. Now we move on to our first 8th generation console, something that many people actually forget is an 8th generation console, which is also really a badge of shame. The Wii U, because this thing is absolute dirt. Hey look, it's reflection time. This thing is an absolute piece of shit. Hated in basically every way, shape and form. It's so terrible. It has an unbelievably bad battery life for a controller. If you thought the PS4 controllers were bad, which pretty much are bad when it comes to PS4, when it comes to battery life on controllers, this is even worse. This has maybe a 3-hour battery life tops. It is brutal and it doesn't hold a charge for shit. Let me give you a perfect example. I believe it was Tokyo Mirage Sessions. When that game was coming out, I'm just going to assume it was that one, I think it might have been something else, I fully charged this controller less than a week, because the game came out on a Friday, so I would have charged it on maybe the Monday or Tuesday. I fully, completely charged it from 0 to max. I left it in, I was either in my drawer or on top of the little stand where I keep whatever current controller I'm using. I turned on my Wii U on the Friday to play the game, and this was fully dead. Now, that's a common complaint before someone says anything to me. It's like, oh, you got a faulty battery or you used it wrong. It's a common complaint that they die even without use because the battery in them is, well, it's Nintendo. They generally use shitty hardware nowadays. So, this completely and understandably explains it. It's got symmetrical sticks absolutely terrible. It's got digital shoulder buttons, or digital triggers we'll call them, absolutely terrible. It's got, I believe this is a resistive touchscreen, so, wait, resistive is the bad one I believe. But you can tell, it doesn't even matter about the resolution of it because it's naturally going to be low. It's not your primary thing to do with. And the most annoying thing is that some games completely and absolutely force it and shoehorn it in. I wanted to play, like after a few minutes of gameplay in Tokyo Mirage Sessions of using this, or it wasn't even actually in gameplay. When I found out the battery of this thing was actually dead, I moved over to my Pro Controller. This is forced into certain games. You cannot play Tokyo Mirage Sessions on the Wii U without this. There are other games as well that absolutely require this, and it was absolutely terrible. One of the biggest flops ever from Nintendo, because let's face it, the only thing they've done that's flopped more is the Virtual Boy, but this thing, absolute shit. Everyone hates it, and I'm so glad they moved away from it. Now, Nintendo knew that was a piece of shit and a piece of absolute dirt, so they released this, the Wii U Pro Controller. Now, there's several issues, but also a couple of positives with this as well. It made gaming on the Wii U bearable. I say bearable because it's still the Wii U at the end of the day. Granted, it had a few games, but controller-wise, compared to the absolute dirt that is the tablet, the very oversized, uncomfortable piece of crap, this one here is actually ergonomic. It's generally, I was going to say quite small, but it's really only quite small in comparison to the Wii U gamepad. It's got what I can only call divisive placement. It's got two analog sticks, but they're not in the Sony position in here. They're up here on the outsides. Now, I know there's a reason for that, and the reason for that is because on the Wii U gamepad, which we have here, the sticks are in the two upper left and upper right corners. Upper left and upper right. So I understand it's to kind of keep the same layout and design. It's just really awkward when you come from, at this time, an Xbox 360 placement here, or an Xbox One placement here, PS3 placement here, or PS4 placement here. And then you come to this new awkward piece of crap. So you see the point. It still has digital triggers, which were really annoying because it's still a step back for Nintendo, because they used analog triggers and analog shoulder buttons on the GameCube, and they still haven't to this day. Looking at you, Nintendo Switch and GameCube emulation and GameCube Virtual Console. But the big positive that this controller had, not just to facilitate gamers to be able to play on a reasonable controller that wasn't a piece of shit, the battery life on this thing is fucking phenomenal. The battery life on this thing is up there with the second best controller battery life it's tied first and second basically, but they're both tied for first, I should say. That's what I meant to originally say before I fucked it up. I can't talk. You think after making videos for this long I'd be able to talk, but the battery life in this controller is brilliant. I'm talking probably 40 plus hours off a single charge. It is brilliant in that aspect. Compare that to the maybe 3.5 hours max you get out of the tablet. It's a no-brainer whatsoever. The battery life on this bad boy is absolutely brilliant. Unfortunately, they were very hard to find, even online and stuff like that as well. And for the longest time, for years after launch, even when the Wii U was dead and buried and flopping around in its grave, and even before that, these were still hard to find and full price. I think I bought this one maybe 2 or 3 years after launch, if it was even that long, and it was still full price. I think this cost me like 45-50 euro. And just before the Switch came out, I couldn't even remember what the name of Nintendo's current console was. Just before the Switch came out, you could still find a couple of these around new online from verified sellers for roughly the same full price. They just never went down, and they were still highly sought after. So while it does have one or two positives, it's still a Wii U controller and still has some Nintendo design, so it is what it is. Now, moving on to the PS4, there's basically two versions of the PS4 controller. There's all the controllers launched before the PlayStation Pro, which would be the original controllers, and then there was the updated model after the PS4 Pro. I don't know if every controller since the PS4 Pro is the updated one, or if they only come with the Pro. But either way, we'll take a look at both of them. There's only one minor difference on them, and we're not going to spend too much on that. So we have our standard PlayStation 4 controller. Now, this is my second PlayStation 4 controller. This is the 20th anniversary one. No, I don't have a 20th anniversary PS4. I just have the controller. But the rubber on the left stick of my original controller split. So I needed to replace it because it became unusable because, well, they're cheap controllers. Well, they're cheaply made controllers. But overall, it's a pretty okay controller. It's not terrible. I know I said in my previous video, it was like a week ago, I can't remember what I actually said in it specifically, but I know I complained about how I don't like the DualShock 4 or the DualShock 3, but it's not unusable. It's not completely terrible. I don't like the symmetrical stick placement like this. It has an okay D-pad. It's not terrible, but it's not great at the same time. It has digital face buttons. Remember in the previous one I talked about analog face buttons on the PS2, which have never been replicated since. They have rectified the trigger situation, which is a big deal. Now, the battery life, actually before we move on to the battery life, we have this piece of crap, the touchpad. Kind of, it's like a laptop touchpad. You don't need to press it in, but it does also function as a button. You have the standard start button basically, and you have your share button. The thing about it is because you have the extra share button, and obviously that doesn't work as your select button, most games will basically substitute this because it's a click as your select button. Now, the big issues with this: one, battery life. Absolutely terrible. Couple of hours. You're talking maybe 4 hours, 5 hours. If you're lucky, maybe 6 hours. Generally, that's considered down to one additional thing. This big light bar piece of shit that Sony was so gung-ho about including and will never remove, but eventually gave us features to turn the light levels down but not off. Absolutely useless. Now, I've blinded myself multiple times with PlayStation 4 controllers. For the simple reason is I'll be playing, I'll lift my hand up with the controller in it, just whatever hand I'm using, just to scratch my eye, scratch my face, scratch my nose, whatever, and let's just say the camera are my eyes. I'll scratch it like this, and I will just, because I can't see it, I'll just blind myself with the light straight away, and it's really fucking annoying. Most people will attribute it to that. There are rumors and tech specs and all out there that suggest that it has its own separate extra battery, but based on the actual big proper battery for this, there's no reason why it should last this poorly and well, I can't even call it this long without the light. Now, also has a speaker on it, believe it or not, by the way. For certain games, you can actually play certain voice sources out through the speaker. I think in Borderlands 2 and Borderlands the pre-sequel, for example, when you get like little voice messages popping up in the corner and stuff, and audio logs and all that, they can actually come out of here. You can turn it on and off in most games. I generally like it. I generally think it's a cool extra little feature. I don't think it's like game breaking to have it or not have it. I just think it's a cool extra little feature. But if you're playing online with friends and stuff like that, you're going to want to turn this off because it's very loud and thin sound, and that resonates through microphones and all very loudly. Now, having said all that, there is one thing I will very highly praise of the PlayStation 4 controller and how Sony have used it. They have made, or how they've utilized the controller. They have made this controller very versatile. Now, what do I mean? Well, obviously, a PS4 controller is going to work on a PS4. That's a given. That's a no-brainer. But they actually updated this. They allow PS4 controllers to be used on PlayStation 3 as well. So if you lose your PlayStation 3 controller, if you don't want to charge it, or if you just prefer this controller, or you don't want to bother sorting it out and digging through whatever, depending on how you have your stuff stored, you can just reconnect this to your PS3 and use it. I think the Sixaxis controls don't work, but as far as I know, everything else bar the Sixaxis works perfectly. So it's still very versatile in that sense. Now, personally, when I dig out my PS3, I dig out the PS3 controllers. I'm old school. I go ham. You know that. I go retro. It's in the name. But one other thing that I do say about this is, if you remember that I mentioned my original version of this controller, my original PS4 controller was split. The rubber on the right side of the left stick was split. You can also use these on PlayStation TV. you know, the home console connected TV version of the PlayStation Vita, you can use these, as well as Dualshock 3 controllers, on a PlayStation TV. So I have that other controller paired up to my PlayStation TV. Granted, I don't keep my PS TV connected up, but whenever I do want to randomly go back and play it, I have a controller just connect it up and sync to it, and I just press the button, it comes on, boom. Well, assuming the controller's not dead. And you get my point. So it's versatile in that sense. The fact that they made it work with kind of a dead handheld or a dead console version of their current-ish handheld, as well as they patched it to work in their old one. I do like that versatility. Something that's very uncharacteristic of Sony, mind you. And there's only one real thing to talk about here, is this is my PlayStation 4 Pro controller. Again, I don't know if all controllers, even sold separately, launched since then, have the updated feature of this one. Because no one could see the light on the back, because let's face it, you're most likely going to be playing like this, the light is pointed away from you, you can't see it. You know, you also can't see it here, but there's a very, very thin translucent bar just at the very top here, so whatever light is coming out from this you can see pointed forward at you. So I did move to this controller originally when I got my PS4 Pro, but this one is a poorly made controller. It's one of those shitty creaky controllers with loose light panels that you could just be playing, and even when you move your thumb just across to get something, just the, I won't even call it friction, but just the slight tension of your hand moving will make the controller creak and the panels creak, and it feels cheap, sounds cheap. I said fuck you, fuck this, there's no extra added benefit, I'm going back to my anniversary controller. Was solidly made and works properly, unlike this piece of crap. Don't worry guys, we're almost there. 2 more platforms to go. Unfortunately, one of these platforms has a significant amount of controllers. So we have the Xbox One. Now the Xbox One controller has gone under several refreshes at this point, so I could cover most of them, but it is what it is, and I'll see how we can get through this. So, first off, we have the original launch Xbox One controller. This would be the 1.0 controller. This is my Day 1 2013 edition controller. For the most part, it's absolutely terrible. The sticks on it are pretty good, I will give it that. They've improved the 360 sticks. It's a pretty ergonomic controller. It's fairly comfortable to use as well. It's not going to slip out of your hands or anything. It's a nice grip, it's a nice shape. It doesn't give you fatigue, controller fatigue, which I don't really believe exists unless you factor in that absolute piece of shit that is the Wii U gamepad. Or the Wii, yeah, it'd be the Wii U gamepad. Now, the thing about it that many people have concerns about, it still uses, well, I forgot I had that in there. It still uses a AA battery style. Again, we've talked about it in the 360 controller as well. There's pros and cons to it. The battery life of the Play and Charge kit, of at least the official ones, is brilliant. You do get a significant amount of time out of them. I will give them that. The problem is they did improve the D-pad over the Xbox 360, but it's still not great on the original controller. It still has your triggers. It's got the equivalent of HD Rumble. I believe they call it tactile feedback. It is a decent Rumble controller on there too. But here are 2 of the, well, with the exception of the D-pad, the 2 major faults with this. It feels really cheap. Like the updated PS4 controller, it has the creaky, horrible panels, as well as it has absolutely terrible shoulder buttons. The triggers are fantastic, but the shoulder buttons are terrible. Left and right bumper are really, really awful. It's such an incredible step back from even a 2005 360 controller. They're really mushy, they're really awkward to press. I won't say hard to press, but you can't really press them up here. You can only pretty much press them here, and even then barely, especially because you're holding it like this. You probably want to just touch it on the side. You can't guarantee you're going to do it. It's really, really shitty in that aspect. Also, they've moved to a proprietary headphone jack or headphone connector at this point. There's no headphone jack on the original one. You could get an adapter to plug in that would give you a 3.5mm headphone jack to use, but additional cost, additional extras, a step back from even the 360, which used I believe it was a 2.5mm headphone jack, not a 3.5 if I remember correctly. Now what we've got here is one of the, not the first refresh updates, because what they actually did first for the Xbox One controllers, they did a small refresh which fixed a little bit of the D-pad and a little bit of the shoulder button mushiness. I don't actually have one of those controllers, but I have the next version of the refresh, which kept the same thing. It kept the improved D-pad, still not perfect, but better than the day one absolute shite. Everything else about it is the same. It's got all the same features and functions. It's got considerably, like, let's see, you're pressing the very outsides, it feels and sounds better. As we're moving in, you can still press them nice and easy. So that is a significant improved benefit on there too. The only other real change on this generation of controllers is the inclusion of the 3.5mm headphone jack as well as the proprietary one. So if you have any type of headphones with a 3.5 jack, any type of headset with a 3.5 jack, you plug it into this bad boy, you're good to go. No extra adapters required for the most part, with the exception of one or two other controllers. Now after that, they did update the controller one more time with the exception of the Elite controller, which I'll talk about separately in this video, but they updated and remodeled the controller when the Xbox One S came out. Now this Xbox One S controller is also the same type of controller they use in the Xbox One Project Scorpio, the Xbox One X version. So this is the Project Scorpio controller that came with Xbox One X. It's not the best way of description, but you can actually tell based on the transition between up here and the actual body of the controller that it's an Xbox One S style controller. I believe all the controllers sold nowadays are the Xbox One S ones. They have Bluetooth as well as wireless, so it can be used on, say, a PC much easier if you know you've got a laptop or a tablet or something with Bluetooth, rather than buying a separate dongle or plugging in a separate dongle for the wireless aspect, or plugging in a USB cable or whatever. Still uses the same deal. You've got your, what do we call it? You've got your, oh my god, I can't even call them true. You've got your AA batteries. There you go. English is hard, people. Still has the 3.5mm headphone jack and proprietary connection, but this controller feels incredibly cheap. It still has upgraded shoulder buttons. It still has the same triggers. It still has the sticks. It has what feels like a downgraded D-pad over, say, my other previous refresh. This D-pad feels worse. And no, it's not just the whole, oh, it's only because you've used this one a lot compared to this. I have the Master Chief version of this controller as well, which I just don't use and have never actually used. And I took that one out of the box, compared it to this, because when I started using this, I was like, this feels really bad, this feels awful. I took out the other controller out, this generation, unused, touched it, straight away I could tell the difference. This D-pad feels terrible in that aspect. And the last complaint I have with this controller is it feels cheap. It's got the creaky panels. It's really, really annoying. I can't keep this in my hand, because once I started using the Project Scorpio, because my Elite controller was on the fritz, I started using this because, well, I said, fuck it, I'll use it, it's upgraded. After maybe 20 minutes, I had to go back to my other one because it feels cheap. I can't not notice it. Fuck you, controller. That's all I can say. Now, as you guys know, I do have an Xbox One Elite controller, but I can't show you that one at the moment. It is sent off to Microsoft to get repaired or replaced. I don't know which one it's going to be. It's covered under my Xbox One X warranty, which was nice by Microsoft. It is one of the better controllers. It's probably the best controller out there at the moment, followed by something we haven't even seen just yet. But it's really, really unfortunate that I can't show you guys that one, because it is a great controller. It feels brilliant. It's got some solid weight to it. It's got customizable sticks. You can get the small 3DS style ones. You can get the standard length ones, or you can get some really, really long ones. Obviously the size is an exaggeration. Depending on how you like to play, you can mix and match them if you like, say, a short stick on the left and a long stick on the right, or whatever it is. You've got two different types of D-pad. If you go with the actual D-pad style ones, they are significantly better. Like, even if you use this style D-pad on it, it's still significantly better than any of the ones that, even on my Halo controllers, for example. You've got stuff like the hair triggers, depending on what game you play and what guns you use, they can actually come in really handy. And you've got the programmable paddles on the back, which again can come in really handy. Great controller, fantastic, a bit pricey, but I absolutely love it. Now we're almost finished, so last up we have this bad boy. the Nintendo Switch. Now, the Nintendo Switch can be played in usually what's called 3 different modes. There's more than that, really, if you ask me, or 3 different controller configurations. This one would be handheld mode. So Nintendo have opted for a more standard placement this time, because they know that was one of the big issues when it came to the Wii U. So you've got a stick on the top left and a stick on the bottom right, similar to that you'd have on a regular controller. It obviously has other benefits too, because you can take them off, snap them side by side, or not side by side, snap them one each, turn them side by side, and use it like, say, we call it stick or control on the left and buttons on the right. Big issue though, digital shoulder buttons. Nintendo, why? This is going to give you all sorts of problems with GameCube emulation that you have probably never factored in, because you probably don't want to do it, because it's Nintendo. So this is the way they say it's meant to be played. They like, whoa, swing around, this, that, and the other. Oh, apparently I'm pressing buttons and it's activating. They've also got like mini shoulder buttons inside, so if you're playing it like this, which they're so small and awful, I hate you. Okay, I kind of gave that away, I just got a bit into it, but I absolutely hate these controllers. These are the Wiimote 2.0. Nintendo have successfully managed to trick people into believing these are not Wiimote 2.0s. Absolutely terrible, especially considering that you now do not have a proper D-pad. You have directional buttons, straight up buttons. Remember the C-stick people on the N64? This is what these are. These are terrible. They're small, they're light. I hear they've got good battery life. The tech in them has probably improved from waggle, waggle, waggle to slightly better, but still, these are terrible. I hate them. Absolutely hate these controllers. And if we do get the inevitable Skyward Sword HD remaster on Nintendo Switch, please, Nintendo, don't factor in these pieces of crap. Give us the option to use a Pro Controller. Fuck these things. And even as an indication that Nintendo knows that the Joy-Cons would be hated by many because of their size, shape, Wiimote 2.0, whatever, Nintendo even included a grip with them to be able to play them like a regular controller. They knew that they would be hated because of the size and shape, and they gave this function and feature in here too. Unfortunately, the Joy-Con grip still doesn't feel like a real controller. I don't know if it's too small or too awkward or too narrow or whatever. It just does not work for me as a standard controller. Again, even using this, I still hate it. What I do is I relegate using this to player 2. Anyone who comes over that doesn't bring their own Switch Pro controller, they are using this shit. And just to close out the video with a positive side of it from the Nintendo Switch, so stop calling me a hater in the comment section. Please, please people, you don't even know what you're talking about. We have the Nintendo Switch Pro Controller, an actual quality controller from Nintendo. Again, similar to the Wii U Pro Controller, the battery life in this thing is fantastic. Uses USB-C, also a nice addition, something I'm very surprised at by Nintendo. They do usually stick with old, out-of-date, obsolete tech. Very, very surprised that they've actually done this one. This controller is fantastic. Second best controller I've used in the longest time. Next only to the Xbox One Elite controller. But by comparison, yes, this controller is a little bit expensive at about 70 to 80 euro, depending on where you live. This controller is still about half the price of an Xbox One Elite controller. It can still also be used on a PC if you connect it up through Bluetooth, but still I prefer to use the Xbox One Elite controller. But this makes Nintendo Switch games playable, enjoyable. If I had to use the Joy-Cons, I probably wouldn't have even bought a Nintendo Switch at all. This controller is brilliant. The D-pad kind of lets it down. It can be questionable at times, but it feels great. The buttons, the response, the sticks, even the rumble quality with HD rumble is good. It's better than standard rumble. It's not as good as the top level tactile feedback that, say, the Xbox One Elite controller has, but again, it's half the price. HD rumble, people are calling it revolutionary. It's a little bit overrated, but it's still good. The other big issue I have with this controller are the shoulder buttons. Just like the Joy-Cons, these are digital. It's actually trying to connect and pressing it on there too. Go GG me. But this is all the stuff you think are built into the Joy-Cons. I believe there's only one thing missing, which is the IR pointer. that the right Joy-Con has, but this has all the motion controls, the gyro controls, the HD rumble. It even has the NFC amiibo reader in there too. So it's pretty feature packed. Feels like a real controller for the most part. Functions like a real controller for the most part. And overall, it's probably my second best choice for modern controllers to use, next to the Elite controller. But that one, as I said, is twice the price. So that's it. That's our proper look at all major first-party controllers, whatever, throughout all these years, throughout so many different platforms and so many different ways to play. What's your favorite controller and or why? What's your most hated controller and or why? And what ones do you think deserve honorable mentions or deserve to be called overrated or whatever it is? Let me know all that good stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Thank you for watching. I will see you on the rest of the videos in my channel.